Welcome to the Daily News Roundup, everyone, your source for a quick update on what's happening around the world.
Yeah, we've got quite a bit to get through today, from shootings to international trade disputes and maybe even some Oscar buzz by the end.
Let's start with the very sad news coming out of Sweden. There was a school shooting there today. It's looking like about 10 people were killed.
This happened at the Risbergska School in Orebro. It's an adult education center about 124 miles west of Stockholm.
And tragically, that number does include the suspected gunman. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson has said this is the worst mass shooting in the country's history.
And even more unsettling is that the gunman was not known to police at all. And there's no clear motive right now for the attack.
There are some accounts from people who were there that give us a little more detail. One teacher, Lena Warrenmark, she said she heard maybe 10 gunshots close to her study.
And a student named Marwa said that she actually tried to help a shooting victim that was bleeding really badly.
It's just awful news.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely reminds us of the devastating impact of gun violence. All right, well, let's shift gears a little bit and look at the conflict in Ukraine. The city of Pokrovsk is facing a lot of pressure as Russian forces are moving in.
Yeah, it's really become a critical point. The Russian troops are less than 2 kilometers away.
And we actually have a pretty interesting perspective on the situation there from Anton Yarmchuk. He's a Ukrainian cinematographer, and he left his life in Berlin to help evacuate civilians from some of these really dangerous frontline areas.
Which is dangerous work. I mean, back in December, he was in a drone attack that hit his vehicle.
And his team recently came under fire again. A British volunteer working with them actually lost limbs during a rescue mission.
Wow.
Yeah. And despite the danger, Anton is still going back to help people get out. He actually told a story about one woman, Olga. She's 71 years old and didn't want to leave the home she's lived in for 65 years.
I can't imagine.
He also said that he saw an elderly woman who refused to leave her son's grave, just showing you how devastating this conflict has been for people and families.
Absolutely. Turning to some trade news now, the US Postal Service has temporarily stopped accepting packages from mainland China and Hong Kong, although letters are still going through.
And this comes after President Trump increased tariffs by 10% on all those Chinese imports. It seems like the goal is to close a tax loophole that a lot of these Chinese e-commerce businesses are using.
Yeah, like Shene and Temu,
Yeah,
big players. And China has retaliated by putting their own tariffs on some U.S. imports like coal and LNG. This trade war is really heating up.
it is. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. All right, in other news, the Aga Khan passed away. A lot of people will remember him for his philanthropy and his role as a spiritual leader.
He was 88. He died in Lisbon, Portugal.
He was the 49th hereditary imam of the Ismaili Muslims, a position that goes all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad.
That's right.
He was actually born in Switzerland, but he held British citizenship and lived in France. And he was known for having a pretty lavish lifestyle. You know, private island, a yacht, those kinds of things.
Right, but he was also very dedicated to philanthropy. The Aga Khan Development Network has done a ton of work in healthcare and education and cultural preservation, mainly in developing countries.
He was also a big fan of horse racing. He owned and bred racehorses. And one of his favorites, Shergar, actually won the Derby back in 1981.
Oh, wow. So thousands of people are leaving the island of Santorini in Greece right now. There have been hundreds of earthquakes over the past few days.
Yeah, over 300 tremors. There hasn't been any major damage yet, but officials are being cautious, schools are closed, and they're saying that people should avoid large gatherings indoors.
Makes sense.
A lot of the residents are actually sleeping in their cars. They're too scared to stay in their homes. And, you know, it's the peak of tourist season, so this is really disruptive.
I bet. One tour guide, Kostas Sakavaris, described the situation as really scary, just because the sound of the earthquakes is so unsettling. But Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis has called for calm.
Well, hopefully things settle down there soon. Unfortunately, we've got more news about escalating tensions in the Middle East. 2 Israeli soldiers were killed in a shooting in the occupied West Bank.
This happened in a village called Taysir. It's north of Tubas, and that's where Israel has been carrying out a large operation against Palestinian armed groups.
And this is all happening amidst this surge in violence in the West Bank that we've seen since the Hamas attack on Israel in October 2023 and then that war in Gaza that followed.
Right. And a UN official has warned that the situation in the Jenin refugee camp is getting really bad. They're saying that it could lead to ethnic cleansing.
And Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has accused Israel of trying to displace Palestinians through this operation.
So things are very tense there, for sure. Switching gears to tech news, Google's parent company Alphabet has dropped their promise to never use AI for weapons or surveillance.
Yeah. They removed a whole section from their AI principles. It was the one that banned any uses that were likely to cause harm.
Wow, big change.
It is. And this is causing a lot of debate about how ethical it is to use AI in war and surveillance. People are worried that it could be misused.
Definitely. And Alphabet said in their blog post that democracies need to lead the way in developing AI for national security.
Interesting take. But let's move on to U.S. politics now. So the Senate has confirmed a few more of President Trump's nominees for cabinet positions.
Including Pam Bondi as the next U.S. Attorney General.
Right, and this was a pretty controversial pick. Bondi has been very critical of the criminal cases against Trump.
Yeah, she even said that she would end what Trump calls the weaponization of the Justice Department against Republicans.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard. They've also moved forward in the confirmation process, but they've both faced a lot of scrutiny over some of their past positions.
Yeah, Kennedy. Who's up for health secretary? Well, a lot of people are concerned about his stance on vaccines.
And Gabbard, who Trump picked to be the director of national intelligence, she's been criticized for defending Bashar al-Assad and that trip she took to Syria back in 2017.
Interesting. Well, China's still pushing back against those U.S. tariffs. They've announced their own retaliatory tariffs on American goods, things like coal and LNG, even large engine cars.
And they're going after specific companies, too. They've blacklisted PVH Corp., which owns brands like Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger.
Oh, wow.
And they've imposed export controls on some pretty important minerals like tungsten and tellurium.
So they're not messing around?
Not at all. And they're even taking aim at big tech companies. They've launched an investigation into Google for possible antitrust violations.
It seems like they're being a lot more strategic this time, not just reacting, but really using a variety of tactics to fight back.
Yeah, definitely showing that they're not backing down. Okay, well, jury selection has begun in the trial of Hadi Matar. He's the man accused of attacking author Salman Rushdie.
Right. And Matar is facing some very serious charges. Attempted murder and assault. This stems from that incident back in 2022 when Rushdie was stabbed and ended up losing sight in one eye.
This trial's been delayed a couple of times already.
It has. First, because of concerns over Rushdie's memoir about the attack. And then there were requests to move the trial to a different location.
Understandably, security is going to be really tight, and Rushdie might actually appear in court to face his attacker.
This whole case brings up some really tough questions about free speech and religious extremism. The attack on Rushdie was seen by a lot of people as an attack on intellectual freedom, especially given all the controversy surrounding his book, The Satanic Verses.
Absolutely. Moving on to South Africa now. The government there has passed a new land law, and it's causing some international controversy.
Well, yeah. President Trump even threatened to cut funding to South Africa over this. He's claiming that the law allows for land confiscation.
And Elon Musk, who's a close advisor to Trump, has also been criticizing South Africa's land ownership laws.
Right.
So President Cyril Ramaphosa had a call with Musk to try and calm things down.
I see.
He wanted to emphasize that South Africa is committed to upholding the rule of law and ensuring equality for everyone.
And this whole issue of land ownership in South Africa is very complicated. It goes back to the legacy of apartheid.
It does. And the government is trying to address those historical injustices with these land reform efforts. But of course, it's a sensitive issue, and there are concerns about the potential impact on the economy.
It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. Well, Australia has banned the Chinese AI startup DeepSeek from all government devices and systems.
Because of national security risks.
Yeah. This comes after DeepSeek launched this incredibly advanced chatbot that actually caused some ripples in the global stock markets.
Wow.
The Australian government is saying that the ban isn't specifically because DeepSeek is a Chinese company, but a lot of people are connecting the two.
Right. It definitely reflects the growing concerns about Chinese technology and data security.
Yeah, it reminds me of the restrictions that were placed on Huawei and TikTok.
For sure. And this whole issue of data privacy and how information collected by AI chatbots could be misused, that's a big concern, especially when it comes to sensitive government data.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. All right, let's talk about Ghana. It's one of the top exporters of cashews in the world, but the industry there is struggling to really maximize those profits.
Because they end up shipping out a lot of those cashews raw and unprocessed.
Exactly. They miss out on all the added value and higher profits that come with selling roasted cashews or other finished products.
One of the biggest problems they're facing is the lack of access to affordable financing.
Right. Interest rates are so high there that local producers just can't afford to invest in the equipment they need to process those cashews.
I talked to Mildred Akosia. She's a cashew processing entrepreneur in Ghana, and she said that it's almost impossible to get a loan from a bank. She's had to rely on family loans and even grants from donors.
Wow.
And the government has tried to encourage local processing. They even tried banning the export of raw cashews at one point.
Mm.
But they haven't really solved this problem of limited access to capital.
So it seems like there needs to be a multi-pronged approach here. They need better access to financing for sure, and they need to strengthen their supply chains, and they need a stronger domestic market for processed cashews.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with no easy solutions. Well, India's been trying to navigate the global trade landscape under President Trump's America First policies.
And they've been doing some interesting things. Like recently, they reduced import duties on motorcycles, specifically Harley Davidsons.
Really?
Yeah, it seems like a move to appease the U.S. and try to avoid getting hit with those tariffs.
Makes sense. India does have a pretty significant trade surplus with the U.S.
They do, and they have a diverse export base. But there are still some sticking points like access to agricultural markets.
Right. But India does have those strategic ties to the U.S., and Prime Minister Modi has a decent relationship with President Trump.
So that could help keep things balanced. Now, there's this possibility that the U.S. might start sending convicted criminals to El Salvador to serve their sentences in a mega jail there.
It's part of an agreement that President Nayib Bukele made with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Essentially, the U.S. would be outsourcing part of its prison system to El Salvador.
Wow. And the focus seems to be on transferring members of gangs like MS-13 and Tren de Aragua.
The ones that have been designated as foreign terrorist organizations by the U.S.
Right. And that mega jail in El Salvador,
Yeah.
CCOT, it can hold 40,000 inmates. But there have been a lot of criticisms about the conditions there.
And there are some major legal questions about sending U.S. citizens or lawful residents to a foreign prison.
That's a huge issue. This really reflects the Trump administration's stance on immigration and crime.
It does, and it raises questions about sovereignty and human rights and how countries cooperate on law enforcement.
Fascinating, but definitely a lot to unpack there. So China has this five-pronged approach they're using to push back against those U.S. tariffs and trade restrictions. Well, first, they've got their own targeted tariffs on U.S. goods. Then there's that anti-monopoly investigation they launched against Google. And they've been blacklisting certain U.S. companies, and they're imposing export controls on rare earth metals. And they're actively looking for alternative supply chains.
It's definitely more than just simple retaliation this time.
Right. They're really leveraging their strengths, and they understand their position in the global supply chain.
It shows that they're confident and that they're serious about this trade dispute.
For sure. So President Trump's America First trade policy has been all about using tariffs as a diplomatic tool. His goal has been to reshape global trade and put the U.S. in a more favorable position.
And he's had some success with that, like getting those border security agreements with Mexico and Canada.
Right. But this approach has definitely caused tension.
Especially with China. That trade war is a prime example of how this kind of strategy can lead to disruption and instability in the global economy.
Absolutely. And it's really unclear what the long-term consequences of Trump's trade policies are going to be. But it's definitely something that economists and world leaders are watching very closely.
All right, well, let's end on a lighter note. The gaming world is celebrating a big anniversary. The Sims is turning 25.
25 years. Wow. It's amazing how popular that game still is.
It is. I mean, think about it. This virtual world where you can build houses and have families and live out different lives, it's been around for a quarter of a century.
Quarter of a century. And it's still going strong.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is that the game is so open-ended. You can really do whatever you want in it. And it's always adapting to the times, keeping up with social trends.
Like what?
Well, for example, The Sims has always been pretty inclusive. I mean, they had same-sex relationships in the game from the very beginning, and they've been working to improve representation even more over the years.
That's great.
Yeah, it's a good example of how video games can be a force for good, creating inclusive and engaging experiences for all kinds of people.
Absolutely. And speaking of great performances, actress Mikey Madison is getting a lot of Oscar buzz right now for her role in Anora.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. She plays a stripper who marries into this super rich family, right?
Yeah, she marries the son of a Russian oligarch. And critics are saying that her performance is incredible, really nuanced, vulnerable, and strong, all at the same time.
The film was directed by Sean Baker.
Oh, wow.
And apparently he actually wrote the role specifically for Madison.
That's awesome. And the movie won the Palme d'Or at Cannes.
Wow. So it's already got some serious awards momentum.
It does, and Madison has already been nominated for a Golden Globe and a BAFTA.
So yeah, the Oscar buzz is definitely real.
It is, and if she wins, she'll be one of the youngest Best Actress winners ever.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's Daily News Roundup. We covered a lot of ground as usual, from the tragic to the hopeful.
We did, but that's the world we live in, right?
It is, and it's important to stay informed and stay curious. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from around the globe.
See you then.
And remember, to really stay informed, you've got to seek out different perspectives and look beyond the headlines.